All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to the panel discussion of In Plain Sight, Reclaiming Hidden Histories. I will be your moderator for today's discussion. My name is James E. Stewart, and I am the Vice President of Friends of Geer Cemetery. In Plain Sight is an exhibit currently located along the old carriage track in Durham's historic Geer Cemetery. In Plain Sight is sponsored in part by a grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council and many generous donations from community members, as well as the product of hundreds of hours of research, writing, fabrication work done by dozens of volunteers. Our conversation today deals with the longstanding inequalities surrounding historical Black spaces, like that of Geer Cemetery. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our illustrious panel. We have William Sturkey, an American historian, author, and associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Angela Thorpe, the associate director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. Andre D. Vann, archivist, author, griot, educator, and the coordinator of the University Archives and instructor of public history at North Carolina Central University. And Vanessa Hines, the director of the Stagville Memorial Project. That order in which I introduced our panel will be the same order in which I will be asking them our opening questions. To go further into Mr. Sturkey's history, he is a historian of the modern American South who teaches courses on modern American history, Southern history, the Civil Rights Movement, and the history of America in the 1960s. His first book, To Write in the Light of Freedom, is a co-edited collection of newspapers, essays, and poems produced by African American Freedom School students during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. His most recent book, Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White, is a biracial story of Jim Crow that was published by Harvard University Press in March of 2019. Welcome, Mr. Sturkey. So for our first question, I know this is a question most historians often get, but help us understand how we got here. How did inequality get written into our historic landscapes?
Well, I think that one of the ways this happens was that resources were not given equally to Black and white communities. The African Americans who were buried in Geer are people who helped build the city of Durham itself, and they were also people who paid taxes, but those tax dollars were not often used to support Black public spaces like Geer Cemetery because of the process of Jim Crow. African Americans were written out of the political process. They couldn't participate in the democracy.
In what ways does that affect other areas, not excluding Geer Cemetery, but other historical spaces, historical Black spaces that we don't often hear about throughout history books?
Well, I think that it's a system that has basically underfunded African American communities. Like cemeteries are just one example, but neighborhoods, paving roads, schools, colleges, whatever that might be. It's sort of this routine where most resources have been given to local white communities. I'd actually prepared just a few minutes of remarks where I wanted to just sort of historicize this just a little bit more for the audience, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But I actually want to just start though by just highlighting all the work that the Friends of Geer have been doing to preserve this historic cemetery for so many years. It's really an honor to work with this group. It's an incredibly impressive and dedicated group, and I'm realizing now that I probably owe my dues for the yearly renewal. But I went by the cemetery yesterday and I saw the new signage and all the work that y'all have been doing, and I just want to congratulate the Friends of Geer on their efforts. It really looks great, and it really looks like what it always should have been. For those folks in the audience that might not know, Geer was established in 1877. So it's the same year that Reconstruction ended. Durham itself was incorporated in 1869. So Geer is almost as old as the city itself. And so Geer was there as the city rose, as it grew from a town of less than 2,000 people to a city of the New South, to one of the leading tobacco processing centers in the world, Geer predated all of that, right? And it contains the remains of many people who were older than Durham itself, some of whom had been born into slavery. And so, in thinking about who's interred at Geer, this question about who's buried there, I think there's a lot of ways to answer that. These were certainly Black pioneers in North Carolina. White folks' names and statues tend to dominate Southern landscapes, and we often celebrate, the rich white people like the Dukes. But many of the people who actually built Durham itself were Black people, and so these were the people that actually put their shovels into the dirt, that stacked the bricks, that hammered the nails, that unloaded the lumber, that drove the wagons, that raised the children, that rolled the tobacco. Right? These people, by the tens of thousands, were Black people. So the people who built Durham are buried in Geer. But not just workers for the city, right? But the people that built Black Durham were people that made Durham into this mecca of modern Southern Black life. Durham was a place that attracted both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, two men that disagreed on a lot, but they both agreed that Durham was an important place, and they both visited its Black community in 1910 and 1912. Du Bois wrote when he visited in 1912 that Durham was a place where a Black man may get up in the morning from a mattress made by Black men, in a house which a Black man built out of lumber, which Black man cut and planed. He may put on a suit which he bought at a colored haberdashery and socks knit at a colored mill. He may cook victuals from a colored grocery on a stove with which Black men fashion. He may earn his living working for colored men, be sick in a colored hospital, and buried from a colored church. This is surely progress. So the people who built that society are the people who are buried in Geer. Margaret Ruffin Fawcett, a former slave and the founder of White Rock Baptist Church, Edian Markham, the founder of St. Joseph's AME Church, Reverend Augustus Shepherd, a man born into slavery who became a minister and the patriarch of a powerful Black family. No husband or father ever did more for the comfort and support and even joy of his family, one author wrote about Reverend Shepherd. And of course, a member of that family, one of his sons, Dr. James Shepherd, became one of the first Black pharmacists in North Carolina and later founded North Carolina Central. And so these people were also more than just these things that they accomplished. They were also, everyday individuals. They were mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and lovers and confidants, dreamers and teachers and children and best friends and people you'd see in the grocery store and people who knew your kids, the people you grew up with, right? All of these people are buried in Geer. But I think one thing that we don't often think of, that all these things that these Black pioneers in Durham were, something that we don't often think of is they were also taxpayers. In fact, that is actually what Du Bois, one of the things that he wrote about when he visited Durham and reported out about Durham to the rest of the world. This is one of the things that he said about Black Durham. He said, and I quote, "The Negroes of Durham County pay taxes on about $500,000 worth of property, or an average of nearly $500 a family. And this property has more than doubled in value in the last 10 years. So of course, the amount you pay in taxes is part of how you might measure your wealth and or your contributions to society. And that's what Du Bois pointed to when he reported to the rest of the world about the progress of Negroes in Durham County, North Carolina. And I just can't help but think about the taxes that Black Durham residents have paid over the decades. This is back to my point about resources. How much of those taxes went into Geer? Well, not many at all, into protecting their resting places and preserving the memory of their ancestors. The city of Durham, like many Southern cities for Black taxpayers, has failed its citizens, its Black taxpayers. The taxpayers paid for Durham's Confederate monument. Nobody ever left Durham to go fight in the Civil War because Durham didn't even exist until after the Civil War. Yet in 1924, North Carolina's all-white legislature gave $5,000 of state taxpayer money to erect a Confederate monument in Durham. And Geer didn't get hardly a nickel back then. In our own time, we're obviously continuing to struggle with questions about race. And I think part of the reason we've struggled so much is that we've never fully dealt with this past, right? We've never come close to reckoning with that history. And I think one of the things that's important about our discussion today is how this injustice of Geer Cemetery and these resting places fit into that conversation about past wrongs in our society. But one thing that I want to emphasize too is that Geer is so interesting because it's also recreated in perpetuity. Geer's still right there looking at us. The Black mothers and sons and daughters of old Durham are still watching us from their resting places. And Geer Cemetery wasn't just unfunded and ignored in the Jim Crow era from 1877 to the 1960s. It's also been left to rot in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s. And I just can't help but wonder, when will the time come to honor the remains of those Black mothers and daughters and sons, and to operate with this radical idea that Black people and their ancestors should be treated and remembered just as equally as white people. So that's just kind of a few of the points that I've been thinking about leading up to this talk about Geer. So I'll turn the table back over to you, James.
Thank you for that, Mr. Sturkey. Thank you for, one, breathing life into the story of Geer Cemetery just now and making a very real history that is not just numbers and statistics and facts, and bringing it full circle to why it matters that we need to highlight and uplift these spaces, just like any other historical space throughout Durham, throughout North Carolina. Thank you for that. Moving on to Angela Thorpe, I want to give a little bit of history about her. Angela Thorpe is a military brat whose roots are tied to the small tobacco farming community of Pine Tops, North Carolina. Angela returned to her roots after receiving a BA in history with a minor in African American studies from the University of Florida. She pursued an MA in history with a concentration in museum studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Here she began her quest to connect Black communities and their stories to a diversity of heritage spaces. Angela joined the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission as Associate Director in 2017 before being hired as Director in 2019. Prior to this, she worked at the President James K. Polk State Historic Site in Pineville, North Carolina, and the History Makers Video Oral History Archive in Chicago, Illinois. Angela has written on museum professionals, public history, and race for the National Council of Public History. She has also spoken on diversity and inclusion in museums and cultural institutions, community engagement, and African American heritage at conferences and symposia. Thank you for joining us this morning, Angela.
Thank you for having me, James.
So our question for you this morning is, this complicated history at times leaves us with even more complicated work ahead of us. Mm-hmm. What can be, and in your experience at the state level of North Carolina, what can be and is being done to lift up and care for these historic spaces so that they survive?
Wonderful, that's a great question. And like Dr. Sturkey, I have some remarks prepared to really lean into that question. I'll note that Dr. Sturkey did an incredible job in grounding us in why African American cemeteries and burial grounds are in the state that they are in. And I'll note that this is not just a Durham issue. This is not just a North Carolina issue. This is a national issue. And so what I'm going to do today for our guests, I'm going to zoom out, talk about what is happening at the state level. And then I'm going to zoom back into Geer Cemetery and talk about what we as the state can learn from what is happening at Geer Cemetery. The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission holds as its mission to preserve, promote, and protect North Carolina's African American history, arts, and culture for all people. And that work shows up in a lot of different ways, including responding to the need around low-resourced and at times neglected Black cemeteries and burial grounds across the state of North Carolina. To that end, in 2019, the African American Heritage Commission, my organization, partnered with the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology to launch an African American Cemeteries and Burial Grounds Preservation Initiative. I'll note that Office of State Archaeology, African American Heritage Commission, both state agencies. We are under the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And this is really a partnership that is fueled by what I would describe as brilliance, passion, and expertise. So no money is behind this initiative, but really it's this brilliance and this expertise and these partnerships that are really driving what you are seeing at the state level. And so I'm going to talk about 4 things that we have done with this initiative. 1, we have worked very diligently to connect intimately with constituent groups, moving various cemetery-related issues forward. We have worked or connected with groups literally across the state. So from Asheville, North Carolina into Southport, North Carolina. And really what we're trying to do now is identify a couple of different communities that we can work in on a couple of different pilot initiatives. The hope is that these pilots will create opportunities to form, strengthen, and ultimately grow support strategies for even more cemetery groups across the state. So just to give a couple of examples of what these intimate pilots are looking like. In Asheville, this is looking like having conversations and listening to a group that is doing really, really well to preserve an African-American cemetery. We're learning what community engagement centered in values of healing, repair, and collaboration can look like. And we're hoping to pull some of these tools to support other communities. In Milton, North Carolina, this looks like educating a municipality and providing some mediation as a means to push this municipality to steward a Black cemetery. So we're doing equity work. In Elizabeth City, this looks like connecting universities and students and faculty to community groups preserving cemeteries as a means to provide coursework and hands-on training to students to steward local cemeteries. And in New Bern, this work looks like helping local groups working on multiple Black cemeteries work in alignment with one another. And in Anson County, North Carolina, this looks like what happens when the primary steward does not live in our state. How can we activate local groups to help this person steward a place where their ancestors are buried? We have also worked to connect experts to constituents. So our Office of State Archaeology does have a historic cemetery preservation specialist. And so part of our work has looked like making this specialist more accessible to Black constituents across the state. We have worked to create resources. For this initiative, you will begin to see more from the African American Heritage Commission, particularly in the summer. We're going to have a website with some educational videos, with some content. We will be putting together a Facebook group so that Black cemetery preservation groups across the state can connect with one another and exchange ideas. And perhaps the resource that I'm most excited about that we've created is something called a citizen cemetery forum. Black cemeteries in our state are not well documented, and this form is designed to remedy that reality. This is a form that folks can fill out and then send back to the Office of State Archaeology so that 1, Black cemeteries are documented in the state's cemetery database, and then state resources can be sort of given more equitably to Black cemeteries across the state. I'll note that as a final measure in our initiative, we also have done some work at the federal level. We recently endorsed the African American Burial Grounds Network Act that was introduced a couple of years ago. I had the pleasure of testifying before Congress around the need for that bill in states like North Carolina and others. And so that gives you a snapshot of some of the work that is taking place at the state level, particularly for the Commission and the Office of State Archaeology's African American Burial Grounds Preservation Initiative. So to kind of zoom into Geer Cemetery, what can we as a state learn from what's happening here? Really, I think that there are 5 things. 1, this work takes time and creativity. I'm so moved and excited by what has happened at Geer Cemetery, but I realize that it's taken time to stay the course, and again, this group has had to be really creative in finding resources and volunteers and moving their work forward. And so that is something that we can communicate to other groups across the state, really, that this work takes time and creativity. Something else is that everyone's not willing to do everything, but everybody is willing to do something, right? Maybe the folks that volunteer for cemetery cleanups are not necessarily the people who need to be on your friends group, but you can activate communities and put folks in different positions. Maybe the Historical Society is not the right steward of your cemetery, but they can support you in doing some of that research work or developing a walking tour or an exhibit. And so the work of the Friends of Geer Cemetery has really helped us to understand how we can help other cemetery groups across the state think about how to activate people in different ways. The third thing is that there are resources, whether those are intellectual resources or financial resources. I think what's really exciting about In Plain Sight is that it was a funded project by the North Carolina Humanities Council. So pushing groups to think out or within a spirit of abundance rather than deficit is critical. 4, and Dr. Sturkey mentioned this is equity work, right? And doing this equity work actually pushes communities towards justice work. This is a message that I think is most critical for municipalities that we're working with that in many cases are refusing to steward Black cemeteries well or at all. And finally, communities don't have to do this alone. I look so forward to connecting other groups to the Friends of Geer Cemetery and vice versa. I think that creating exchange will help people feel that they're not in the wilderness and that they can learn from work that is happening well across our state. Ultimately, I think what we can learn to boil it down is that what is happening in Durham actually creates pathways for other groups across the state to do this work well. And I'll note that while I'm serving as a panelist today, I value curiosity, I value exchange. And so I look forward to what I will learn today. And as the representative of the state, I look forward to taking these tools back to cemetery groups from across the state to help them move this work forward better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. That was incredible. Thank you for highlighting the different qualities that are required for this work. And thank you for showing that it's not a one broad brush stroke that can take care of everything, that there's a lot of different aspects. And thank you for highlighting across the state the different levels of work that needs to be done in different areas. And also, we really look forward to what's going to be coming from the African American Heritage Commission in the months ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we have Mr. Andre Vann, and let me give a thorough bio of Mr. Vann. Andre D. Vann is an archivist, author, griot, educator, and is the coordinator of the University Archives and instructor of public history at North Carolina Central University. His research interests include African American history, 20th century United States history, Southern history, African Americans in public history and public memory, and civil rights. He's especially interested in understanding the complex connections between African American history, memory, funerary, race, and social change in Durham, North Carolina throughout the 20th and 21st century. He shares much of his research interests with students in a course entitled History 2890, Historical Methods and Applications in History, which explores research topics in humanities. He has authored Standing on the Promises, The Growth and Development of Shiloh Baptist Church of Henderson, North Carolina, 1866 to 1996, and published works in the African American National Biography, 2008, Encyclopedia of African American Associations, and the Encyclopedia of African American Education. He authored African Americans of Durham County in 2017. He co-authored a book entitled Sedalia and the Palmer Memorial Institute in 2004, authored one book entitled Vance County, North Carolina in 2000, and co-authored another entitled Images of America Durham's Hayti in 1999. All are still in print. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Vann.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James. And I'm glad to be here with you all. And what a wonderful opportunity to have and to be able to share and bring into the public consciousness the work of this great organization and group.
Thank you. My question for you this morning, Mr. Vann, is word is spreading about Geer Cemetery, but as we know, this is the result of systemic racism and inequalities. These hidden spaces aren't rare occurrences. So where and how are people finding them, and how are we documenting them to ensure that they are preserved?
All right. Well, I have a presentation I'm going to bring up in the next minute, but I would just say that you know, when you think about this work of sort of reconstructing the lives of those who are interred in Geer Cemetery, it teaches one to possess, you know, the very important and very soft skills of patience, first of all. But also, I like what Angela mentioned about that question of curiosity, being curious about what is out there, because we will find that there are many materials that are out there, in both public and private hands as well. So I'm going to bring up just a little bit. I know we're on the schedule, but I'm going to bring up just a little bit in terms of this presentation here to sort of help guide us in terms of this. And I would note as well, and I hope everyone can see that that when one thinks about the question of researching into this work, it's important really to understand that it requires a community effort. It can be an individual, but also requires community effort. And so I'm going to start by giving you a few guiding thoughts that are here. There are some that are here, such as this question of movements and memory, and that the importance of such. And it's important to recall. And memory plays a very important role in terms of cemeteries and where people are buried, and the stories that are passed down. And we also find that these stories also become mobile, and they travel and they go to different places. And you'll get a chance to see that in a second. But also that each and every town and city has a history and has a past, right? And as we know, whether good or bad. And so it's important to sort of find ways to sort of delve and find these bits and pieces of history. But I would also note what Professor McMenemy noted. He said that historians sometimes have to compile evidence themselves, filling in the gaps by venturing to go after the evidence. And that's important, the question of going after the evidence. But it's also important about looking at how cemeteries help us to sort of reconstruct a new narrative about African-American life. It's easy to sort of confine someone to a grave and say, oh, well, that's where they are. But it's even more brave and courageous, I think, to sort of weave in these wonderful histories and narratives of those who are interred and buried there. And that includes looking at the burial practices, race relations, and looking at even life from post-emancipation through the Jim Crow era and desegregation as well. But it's also important to understand that there are gaps in the historical narrative and the record and the scholarship there. But each and every day, new forms of scholarship and new forms of materials are being made available each and every day. And then mostly as well, we have to be willing to sort of challenge these narratives that exist there by, again, weaving in these stories, talking about the women who are interred there, talking about the working class communities that reside there. And this does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in totality as well. And I'm gonna quickly move on. When we talk about memory, and we start with individual memory, but it's important to understand that these individual memories, such as the work that you're engaged in now with the Friends of Geer Cemetery, then becomes a collective memory, and where you're bringing into the public consciousness the work of this cemetery. And I wonder how many may have passed by this cemetery for so many years and wondered, what was this story? What was there? And also, we really have to understand that that bits and pieces of our history are painful pieces of our history. And so none more important than when we talk about cemeteries and those who are interred there. That is a point that is painful in the life and history of others, but the remedy is that we get to add new life and new stories to those interred in Geer Cemetery. Also important, quickly, to note that the stories, when we talk about these memories, they travel. And so this is a wonderful map that Professor Arwen Smallwood at North Carolina A&T shared with me, which sort of looks at the Great Black Migration. And as you can see, North Carolina is clearly noted there on the right margin there to give you an idea of understanding how these stories and these narratives and these histories of those who were interred there, where they reside all across the country, not just in Durham alone. There are numerous sources also, I think, that you can look at. Those that have been most consequential to me, not the others are not important. Lay down body for those who are interested in looking at secondary sources and their import and impact. But also I would urge you as well to look into a very curious piece, a work entitled To Serve the Living. And it really traces the growth and development of the African-American funeral director and mortician as a clear connection to the African-American community, as a clear way to sort of document these experiences of those who interred. I will always tell you that it's good to talk to the funeral director. As I move to the next page, I will tell you one of the great statements that one of the great funeral homes in my hometown of Henderson says. He says it's better to know us and not need us than to need us and not know us. And so I learned that, you know, when you build on these connections to the funeral directors, they can supply you with a great deal of materials. Otherwise, you may not be able to get in. So let me begin as I prepare to close this out by sort of taking a look at some of the individuals and who are they. And so I'll start with Miss Cynthia Pearson. Many talk about her husband, George W. Pearson, because his visible image of his historical mark is there. But I was pleased to gain from the family a photograph, and also Dr. Charles Johnson, who's done a significant amount of work here at North Carolina State University on those interred in Geer Cemetery as well. This wonderful image of Miss Cynthia Pearson. And if you go down to St. Joseph's, you'll get a chance to sort of see that image in the Pearson room that is there. But it's about living, breathing people, individuals who had histories and who had stories. And so I wanted you to sort of see there the wonderful image of Miss Pearson and also Mr. George Pearson, that marker. And look at those great fine words that are primary. The question of death is eternal life. Why should we weep? And that's important to understand. Again, we're talking about individuals who had histories and who had stories. Also, another important resource, for instance, their marriage certificate. It helps to yield, dating back to 1868 in Hillsborough, North Carolina, a very important marker in terms of looking at their life and lived experiences. And so this simple act of a marriage certificate becomes an important piece of history in weaving together these life experiences as well. Census records are invaluable. Anyone that uses Ancestry, and it is given that everyone knows about Ancestry, so I didn't bother to include it. But the importance of the census records in 1870, the first time in which people of color will appear in the census records in most situations, becomes important. And so the Pearsons are highlighted here as well. So that is another record that we can use to sort of validate these lived experiences of those. Going back to Miss Cynthia Barbie Pearson, the death certificate, Mr. R. Kelly Bryant and Miss Carrie McNair and others who valiantly went down to the Register of Deeds office, we call it today, used to be known as Vice Statistics, and recorded those who were interred there. These were important in terms of helping to support the memory that a person was buried there by what we call the historical receipts, the evidence to prove and show that they lived there. And you see lots of wonderful information encased there as well. The use of non-traditional sources, and I'm almost there. The use of non-traditional sources in validating and really reconstructing these lives. And so I use as an example, Mr. Spalding is not buried there. But that funeral program becomes an important document, maybe sometimes the only time in which a written record is created of that person's experience. But look at all the great, wonderful things you get to see and you find about their rich life, that photograph sometimes, the birth and death dates, the maiden names, the names of other relatives, past residences, and the place of burial. And as one who oftentimes is called upon to craft funeral programs, obituaries, you find that it all becomes important. City directories, and also I point to a little known historical piece that everyone should look at. It's called the, and they all are digitized, by the way. It's called the Tobacco Belt Directory. And if you look over to the right and you get a chance to see, right, and we'll again weaving and writing into history, Miss Pearson is noted here being a washerwoman, and that is not something that you would know quite often about this family, who was quite prosperous by this way. But that's a little something of an indicator to understand more about these experiences. I could not be what I am today, was it not for what I call race and place, newspapers. The idea of writing these African Americans in history. And we can thank God for Lewis Austin, thank God for the Gervais in Raleigh, and others who helped to tell these stories. But the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center offers a wonderful opportunity for you to be able to view and see these pieces of history. The Carolina Times Digital, the Raleigh Carolinian, and of course, here at the university, we have our student newspapers, very important ways to help you along that road as well. And then I'm almost closing, a few of the ABCs of research that include looking at archives, both university and family related. Family Bibles become important. Listing out the history. Church records are paramount. But you got to have a little determination when you're involved in this work. Every scrap of paper is important. Funeral home records are necessary, and you must have stick-to-itiveness. And if you don't possess that, that journey gets a little difficult. And so, as I prepare to close, I'm reminded of what David Engelman wrote in the Some 40 Tales from the Afterlives, and he remarked, he said there are 3 deaths. And the first is when the body, as he notes here, ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. But then the third and most important is that moment, sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time. And so, as I know, this is where many of you all can come in by helping to continue to research and tell the stories, go after the names, call the names out, and continue to research these souls that they may be remembered for generations to come. And as you think about that question of what we call historical Black futures, it's important to understand that as we look to the future, how will others be able to find these persons? So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share, and thank you very much, James, for helping open that question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vann. First, I want to thank you for bringing that historical aspect to it and breaking it down, because not each of us that come to this work are historians, and some of us get daunted by that aspect of the work where we don't know where to begin. And by you breaking it down, it made it almost where anybody can access from any point, and you just kind of spread the work out so that it doesn't seem like a huge mountain of research before us and question marks that we don't know where to begin. So thank you for that. And also thank you for the aspect on talking about memory and how that shapes our story, because that excluding parts of memory shape how the story of our country gets told. So that's a very critical piece. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
I want to introduce Miss Vanessa Hines and give a little bit more of her bio as well. Vanessa Hines is the director of the Stagville Memorial Project, an effort to establish a memorial in downtown Durham in honor of those who were enslaved at Stagville Plantation. Throughout this project, she hopes to contribute to the conversation around slavery's historical impact and ongoing legacies. From 2018 to 2020, she served on the City of Durham's Racial Equity Task Force as the chair of Public History Subcommittee. Vanessa received degrees from Biola University and National University, both of which are in sunny Southern California. Although she sometimes misses the West Coast, she and her spouse currently live in Durham with their 3 remarkable children. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Hines.
Thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
So I know you prepared some remarks. I do want to ask a question to guide you there. With the work that you are doing on the Stagville Memorial Project, I'm sure that you, as well as most of us, are working with like-minded people, agreeing that more work should be done to honor Black history and those that made it. Mm-hmm. How do you conduct productive conversations about difficult aspects of our past with those that may have conflicting or indifferent views?
Yep. Well, thank you for that question. That's an excellent question. And if it's all right, I answered that question in my prepared remarks. So if I can, I'll just jump right in.
Yes.
First, I'd like to talk a little bit about why public spaces are perfect to provoke these conversations. And then I'll delve in a little bit to the how we can do that. And then I'll wrap up again with another reason why it's important. So I want to talk a little bit about why public places are perfect to use to provoke productive conversations about difficult aspects of our past. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that using public spaces is a really easy way to educate people, because by definition, they are places for anyone and everyone to enjoy. Our tax dollars are often used to maintain these places. Dr. Sturkey mentioned Black tax dollars earlier in his presentation. Using our public spaces to share community stories with the average community member is a wonderful way to offer information that's often, we can often do it at free of cost or at a low cost. It's a great way to share information with the community with minimal barriers that might otherwise interfere with people's access to information. And also in our public spaces, we can invite people to learn by using their five senses. So we can invite people to engage by giving them something to touch, by inviting them to listen to their surroundings, by inviting them to feel the ground or to think about what they are hearing. It's kind of a really wonderful 360-degree way to get people to interact with their local history. So now that I've talked a little bit about why it's important to use public spaces, I'd love to move on to how we can do that. And I think the most important thing to do when we're trying to provoke conversation about hard parts of our past is to do our best to tell the whole story with the resources that we have and in the best way that we can. I think the bottom line here is that we need to tell the truth. And this truth telling means engaging with local community members and collecting their stories and their memories so that whatever is created in these public spaces is informed by those who were most involved in whatever piece of history that's being shared in these public spaces. And with telling the truth, I think it's important to talk about representation. Representation is important on a very literal level for people to literally see themselves in these stories, or people that they know, or members of their, excuse me, I need to get some water, hold on a second. Yeah, so that people can see themselves in these stories, or their neighborhood elders, or people that were really important to them. I think that representation is also important so that people can identify with other people's stories or their hardships or when they overcame challenges. I just did want to make a side note about this, that I think it's important for newer people who are moving into these established areas. It's important for them to learn about the people who were there, many of them who are still there. And it's important for people who are moving into those communities to enter into these areas with a sort of humility and a sort of reverence for what came before them. And then hopefully when they're entering into these spaces, that along with that they can think about the ways that they can contribute to their particular neighborhoods in such a way that is uplifting for everyone. And then the last thing that I'd like to say here is that it's important to use public spaces to tell our stories for the sake of democracy. I think that it's really important for us to remember that, for example, certain policies that caused real harm, so that we have reminders of what didn't work and ways to not treat people. I think that when we use our public spaces in that way, we create spaces that call us to lament in such a way that's necessary before we can move on. And then on the other hand, I think that we want to use public spaces to shine a light on those who have inspired us to create a more beautiful community with their activism or with their community organizing or with their otherwise positive contributions to our community. And then that can also give us inspiration to create something better for everyone. I think that we can use what we have learned about our local history to really help us actually choose, or to help us think about who we want to elect as city and state leaders. We want to elect leaders who will understand local and regional history. And even better than that, we'd like to elect leaders who come from these regions that they'd like to serve, so that they can bring their experiential knowledge and take that information with them as they are making laws for the communities that they serve. In my Christian faith tradition, we sometimes talk about these things called Ebenezers. And I don't mean Scrooge from Dickens' Tale. I mean the biblical meaning of the word Ebenezer. And at one point in Scripture, after several battles, Samuel, who's a prophet, he placed a stone between two regions as a place of remembrance of when the God of the Israelites helped him. And so whenever anyone looked upon that stone, they were reminded about the time that the God of the Israelites helped them. And so I think that, like, along those same lines, there are many Ebenezers across this city and county of Durham, and places where we can be reminded of those who came before us and who helped us get to where we are today. I like to think about a Durham in the future where we have many more Ebenezers all around that are telling the stories that have up to this point gone untold. So I like to think about what we can or what Durham can look like in the near future as we are telling these stories. I think the last thing that I like to say is that it's important for people to understand that they are a part of history. Everyone who's on this call today is a history maker in some way. And I like to think, or I think that a way to provoke productive conversations about the past is by inviting people to reflect on how the past is continuing to play out in our present, and to help people think about their own agency or their own role in continuing on with the good things that the past has brought, but also that when things are not right, to help them imagine how they can participate in changing the course to bring about the world that they would really like to see. So that's all I have to share today. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel.
Thank you for that, Ms. Hines. And I want to thank you for touching on the Ebenezers and the importance of having more representation of these hidden histories in public spaces, because that does tie into who we're able to see we can have elected in office that represents us. If we don't see representation in these public spaces, then it almost reinforces the idea that the system is not for us and that we don't have access to it. So thank you for that. I know we have a couple of questions coming in from the Q&A, so that is where we will head to for our next segment. Let me see if I can read some of these first. So there's a question coming in from Facebook referencing Andre's third death remark. I would love to hear the speakers talk about how they think we best honor, mark, and mourn the absent, the dead ends, and the dead ends of research, the silences, and the archives. So I want to throw that question to the entire group, and whoever has a response, I'd love to hear from.
I'll be glad to help you out for a second here. And it's a very important question. I was approached by a news reporter a few days ago, and she said, well, Andre, going forward and in the future, how will, given the change in funerary practices, given the change in death, burial, and all the aspects of this work, she said, well, how will the next generation, and I had not thought about this, by the way, I'll be honest, how will the next generation be able to locate and find these individuals? How will they still be able to sort of recognize these lived experiences of African Americans, not for today, but in the future? And I'll be honest, blew my mind, but it was important because it helped me to understand that that if we don't do a better job of sort of helping to collect these stories and histories and these narratives now, then we will be certainly doing a disservice, I think, to the next generation when we talk about the question of Black futures and that history. And what does that look like? Well, we always say, as I teach my students, talking is fine, but if you don't have any historical records or historical evidence, doesn't mean a thing. You're just talking. And so the more we do to sort of document these histories going forward, telling these stories, pulling out of the archives, the shared lived experiences of those who are interred in these cemeteries, and who are they, and sharing these histories and finding new ways to tell them, then the work remains. Okay, now I'm gonna shut up there and I'm gonna pass it on, pass the mic on.
I'd be happy to jump in on one of these questions. I have an actually a really optimistic reading. You know, one of the things that is really great about moving forward is we can discover the histories of working class people, but especially Black people, in ways that we couldn't do 15 years ago. So I have, you know, as a historian, I have access to so many incredible databases. Ancestry is amazing. I can type in people's names to Ancestry and find records going back, you know, the 1870s, 1880s. The same is true for newspapers.com. You know, all these places that try and sell us all this stuff for our own genealogy, historians use that stuff all the time. And so I can plug in somebody's name to newspapers.com and, you know, not only find out where they lived or where they went to school, but like what they served at their 10-year-old daughter's birthday party. You know, like there's a texture and richness to Black life, especially, that is now discoverable because of modern technologies.
I have nothing to add to this question, but I do see a question about documenting family cemeteries that I would love to answer. So I see a question from a guest in Oxford that wants to learn a little bit more about how they can document a family cemetery. I'll note that yesterday I was on a panel at Elizabeth City State University in which we talked specifically about documenting Black cemeteries and cleaning Black cemeteries. So I will drop my email in the chat so that we can send you a link to that presentation. But to give you a bit of a teaser, the most important tool that you can have is this, your phone. This is critical to documenting your family cemetery. Also, in terms of that stone type that you mentioned, I would be delighted to connect you with the Historic Cemetery Preservation Specialist at the Office of State Archaeology, because she can give you specific tips on how to care for that particular type of stone in your family cemetery. Again, it's exciting because these are the types of resources that the state has, and I'm glad to make them more accessible to a wider public.
Can I add in one last point that I forgot to mention as well? Two sources that are valuable that I didn't include here. One was Cemetery Census Index, right? That invaluable all across the state of North Carolina. But it also requires a level of energy, such as been done here with the Friends of Geer Cemetery, where the public gets an opportunity again to help, again, writing people into history by going out and looking and discovering, seeing who's out there, who's buried where, right? And this is ongoing. It can't just be, oh, well, we're just concerned with the historical past. It requires a movement and flow that is continuous. And it's not something that one person needs to sort of engage in, by the way. But also, I was reminded as well, and that's how I found the grave of my great-great-grandmother, died in 1901. Thank goodness, the North Carolina State Archives made available the WPA Cemetery Census WPA Index, right? This is an index of all the cemeteries that were chronicled during the Great Depression, as you would know. And so she, along with only a few, were listed there. And so what I did was I went back and I literally walked the entire, in our hometown, Henderson, I walked the entire cemetery because I wanted to know, well, who's there? and I knew that, you know, it was important. And so, so equally so, Henderson is about to, Vance County, we're about to sort of join this conversation by helping with our cemetery, Blackman Cemetery, do the same, by the way.
Thank you. There's another question I wanted to pose to the group. How can Black communities in Durham help with this initiative?
Well, I would say to certainly get in touch with the Friends of Geer via Facebook or using the email. But, you know, I have to keep stressing this. The city of Durham could pour resources and fix this if they wanted to. That's been the case for over 100 years, right? And so I think something else that could be important to do would be to simply pick up your phone and call your city council people and call the mayor's office and say, look, we care about Black lives in this city. And if we're going to say all the stuff that we constantly hear about equity and diversity and all this and that, well, let's take care of the Black graves just like we do the white graves.
Thank you for explaining that, because the resources are available, and that's obvious as shown in other cemeteries. It's just a matter of where is the money going, and sometimes it's as simple as that.
Let me make just one more very quick point. Oftentimes when you ask somebody that's an elected official in Durham about offering some resources, they say, well, then we'd have to pull resources away from something else. And they always name something Black. They say like it's public housing or it's some other thing, but they always say something Black. They would never imagine that you could take resources away from a white neighborhood, right, or a white cemetery and give them to the Black cemetery, which is exactly what they've been doing with Geer for over 100 years. Let the white cemetery go untended for 115 years, right? That would never even cross their minds.
Exactly.
Yeah. Also, let me note, I served on the Durham Honors Commission. You know, when Durham turned 150, we were sort of tasked with a 7-member commission, tasked with over this year's time to sort of recognize individuals. You know, persons had to be deceased, of course. And so the end result was, you know, overall 150 names because Durham had turned 150. And so that, you know, again, we talk about the question of promises made. You know, I'm old school. You know, if you say you're going to do something, you ought to do it. And if you don't do it, I'll never forget it. Right. So one of the projects that came out of that was, okay, so the people from the community sort of offered up ways in which people should be honored. You know, some were, it could be a street, could be a piece of poetry. But the most important thing was the historical markers, you know, on one of the trails to sort of recognize these folks. And so, you know, I remind folk, you know, I said, well, we did the work. You know, the work that was asked by the city, but to this day, never received not word of not one historical marker whatsoever that's going up. The only mark I can tell you about, because I work to offer a little advice, is a marker and a wonderful, beautiful bench that is going to be dedicated in Beechwood Cemetery. And so that is but one, you know, project where Beechwood and Maplewood Cemetery both will sort of have this question of remembrance of those who interred there for posterity's sake. So there are some wins, and there are also a few losses that exist as well. Okay.
So I'll just jump in here, and this is to your point about what you just said about being a part of the sesquicentennial task force. So as part of the race equity task force, the public history subcommittee, I actually made sure to include that y'all's report in our suggestions, because I hadn't seen anything, you know, since that report came out, and so we just did it as like a gentle nudge, you know, or maybe it should have been a more forceful push, but yeah, it's really important, you know, if you say you're going to do something to do it. So I'm hopeful, especially, you know, as the city council moves to adopt several suggestions that we placed in our 65-page report. I'm hopeful that some of those markers will start to come up.
Thank you both. There's a question posed for Dr. Vann and Dr. Sturkey, asking if you would review the resources for the cemetery research one more time, Mr. Vann, and if Mr. Sturkey would talk about his work with advocacy to care for them.
Again, I guess without pulling the slide back up, it's important to sort of look at everything as simple and basic as, starting with your, for instance, hold on, let me make sure I got it right. So I think it's important, to sort of focus on the local resources, the memories, capturing what others and individuals have shared about individuals who are buried there. Also taking a look at death certificates, birth certificates for some, census records, taking a look at city directories. I mean, it's important, to really be able to sort of go year by year, where did these people live, right? But also the directories will give you a glimpse into the vocation, the world of work for these individuals. That's something that we don't talk about. What did they do? What were their experiences like? Exploring these family Bibles that rest in people's homes. But thank goodness, the state of North Carolina, this is a nod to Angela's people. They started a few years ago digitizing family Bibles, right? And so again, for the public consciousness, the idea that if you don't sort of weave in and go out and research and find these histories, then they will be lost. And so you have to also rely upon funeral programs are important. But I will tell you this one thing, and I'm gonna shut on up, that if it were not for, my sort of research into, Black funeral homes and the funeral director and their work, I would not know as much as I know about the Black community. And I know everybody, and I know everything. But those funeral directors, they have a glimpse into a world that is unseen by most. That when you talk about civil rights, funeral directors, more independent than anyone that you would know. And yet you go into their offices, most, and I know every last one of them here in Durham and all across the state, you sit in their offices, they can tell you more about the history of the city than a city historian. So I say all that to say that, understand, as we say here in the South, that the South is all about relationships. And if you don't understand that, you won't understand anything about the South, right? So keeping relationships and simple and basic as that's important. But do look in your family archives and do see what you can find. And then write it up and share it and tell that story to someone else, to the next generation. That is how these stories are perpetuated.
Quick question, is there any way that we could have access to the slides, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Just to add to Professor Vann's point, Ancestry is a great tool, but Ancestry.com is sold to us as individuals so that we can look at our own past, but it becomes a supercharged tool when you start looking at everybody else's past. And I mean, when you don't just use it to look at your grandpappy and grandma, but to look at, where people came from. And when you see a grave site, you can plug in somebody's name and learn so much about their lives. I have to admit fully that to answer your question, I've been, classic academic professor pretty far up in the ivory tower, talk about the ideas of cemeteries. I haven't done a lot myself to actually help clear them. I should do a lot more. But, these things exist all over the South. I study Mississippi predominantly, and Mississippi's filled with cemeteries like this that sit by, rivers and have been flooded and untended for over 100 years. On our campus at UNC Chapel Hill, we have a Black cemetery that's literally in the same shape as Geer. Actually, it's in worse shape than Geer. And, with how carefully curated our campus is, we got a Black cemetery that's just completely overgrown and abandoned in the woods. It's just crazy that these things exist all over the South and very few people know about them.
Thank you. There was another question that I wanted to switch to, and it was from a organization that we sometimes partner with, Friends of Geer Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This question was to Ms. Thorpe. Speaking on, she spoke directly to the issues that contend here or there in Richmond. Does the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission have written materials that could be shared with community groups there in Virginia?
Yeah, so I answered that question in the chat, but I'm happy to say it now. So there are a couple of sets of written resources. I just shared 2 links from the Office of State Archaeology's website that has some written resources. As I mentioned in my talk, we, the commission, will have more written resources available on our website this summer. So again, some videos, some slideshows, some written resources. And so I'm happy to drop the link in the chat for that. Finally, there are African American Heritage Commissions throughout the Southeast. There are 7 state commissions in total. So I would be more than happy to connect my friends in Virginia to the Virginia version of me. His name is Justin, and he can direct you further.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question that I wrote that I want to pose to the panel. So I know that each of you in various ways have a hand in the realm of education. So I want to ask, with the recent decision of North Carolina State School Board approving new standards that will require social study classes to discuss racism in the country's history, that stirred up a lot of heated debate and some denial. So in what ways do you notice the impact of sharing Black history that has been hidden because of inequality and racism? In what ways do you notice the impact in classrooms and for students?
Look, I'm going to say this very directly. It's absolutely central to modern conservative thought to downplay and deny historical racial disparities. Okay, so the lieutenant governor has come out and said that there's no difference in the historical experiences between Black and white North Carolinians. That's an insane thing to say. Okay, that's just a ridiculous thing to say, you know? And so I think I don't always have the answers. And I think about this question all the times, James, and I don't always have a good answer for it, I don't think. But I do know that there's another side that constantly wants to sweep it under the rug. And to me, that's a good sign that that's doing some good work by actually starting to teach this history.
That's a great measure. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I'm reminded what my grandmother used to say. She always said, tell the truth and shame the devil. And so I say that to mean that, oftentimes, you have this question of those who wish to sometimes sanitize this history and sort of offer it in their narrative voice, which comes at the exclusion of others. But in the 21st century, let me clear it up. We talk about tough pieces of our history. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about lynchings in North Carolina. And I reminded them that, when it comes to the question of race in the entire South, we will talk about crepe myrtles. We'll talk about how sweet our tea is. We'll talk about how lovely the weather is. But we do not do a great job at talking about the question of race. And so you cannot, conquer this great divide and along racial lines that exist in this country unless you take into account the question of race. One of my great mentors, who's like my uncle, the great Dr. John Hope Franklin, as you know, had one of these great race panels, right, where they brought together conversations. I attended 2 of them here in Durham, and I have an autographed copy of that report that President Clinton asked him to do. That report was important because it was one of the first times where you were sort of bringing into the public consciousness the question that there have always been a question of racial divide in America. And if you don't talk about the issues, you will never solve the issues, right? And so I always tell folks, go look at South Africa, right? So the South Africans borrowed what America was doing in terms of this question of Jim Crow and segregation. But yet they also then became the model of reconciliation by understanding that by holding and talking about those hard truths and the negative piece of their history, that they were able to bring about a more clarity and move forward. And until you address the matter, you will never solve the matter. That's just important, okay? I'm gonna shut up.
No, thank you.
So I'll just add something really quickly, that you can't talk about US history without talking about race. Like you just can't do it. You have a very incomplete understanding of United States history if you don't talk about race and oppression and slavery. Like, you know, you end up having what somebody commented earlier in our comments, that you end up telling a myth. You don't tell history, you end up telling a lie. So it's absolutely necessary, you know, that we tell the whole truth to our students.
Yeah, and I'll just close the circle. I don't have a specific answer. I'll note that, one, I'm frustrated by the debate because I'm coming from a place around like, why is there even a debate? There shouldn't be. This should be a no-brainer. One. Two, we've got to get to a place, especially in our classrooms, where we are doing the work of truth seeking, truth telling, and truth revealing. And I think part of the challenge that I feel is like, this is not abstract, and sort of feeding kids lies or untruths has real life consequences, right? These kids go on to be adults, active citizens, decision makers in society, right? And so if this is what they are coming out of the classrooms understanding, again, a series of untruths, it has huge implications for the future of our nation. I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now, or at least a piece of it. And so that's part of my frustration and energy around what's happening in our state.
Thank you. And I just want to highlight how even in my history and schooling, growing up in Durham, it was being in classes with Black teachers that went out of their way to explain the hidden histories that weren't included in textbooks, but around us in Durham that would never be in the curriculum, that influenced my thought and my viewpoints of myself, of my culture, and that can only be expressed, you know, tenfold to every other student that has that information. And you think about who might not, because of who their teacher might be, that's upsetting. So thank you for that. And actually, I think we're gonna wrap up our discussion for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Again, thank you, Mr. Sturkey. Thank you, Ms. Thorpe. Thank you, Mr. Vann, and thank you, Ms. Hines. Thank each of you for joining us today. And thank you for your individual work to the Black community and adding to the collective work of preserving our history and telling our stories. I also want to thank Deborah Taylor Gonzalez Garcia, Friends of Geer Cemetery President, and Nicholas Levy, fellow board member and coordinator of In Plain Sight, for helping organize today's discussion. And thank you to our audience for attending today. To find out more about the exhibit In Plain Sight, visit durhaminplainsight.com. To find out more about Friends of Geer Cemetery, how to join, as well as where to find bios of our panelists today, visit our Facebook page or our Instagram page at Friends of Geer Cemetery. Thank you all for joining us, and take care.